María con las bellezas de Puerto Rico, uno se maravilla de que Puerto Rico es alegre, de que nos gusta fiestar. Pero al venir María, entonces nosotros pudimos ver lo jodidos que estábamos.
El verdadero desastre vino después. Más de 5.000 personas fallecieron por la inacción precisamente del gobierno.
New investors are coming to Puerto Rico, people that want to protect their wealth.
Government services should be privatized and put in your hands because you can make money doing it.
El gobierno que parece que no le importa la economía en la que tú tienes que sobrevivir.
Entonces no es justo.
How well is that going right now?
Ten mucho cuidado con cómo usted me está hablando, amigo. Usted es un hombre blanco y está en mi terreno.
Común denominador es el bienestar común. Y a la gente sentirse vulnerable, pues ¿qué van a hacer?
Después de María dijimos, ¿sabes qué? No.
¿Cómo soy yo para decirle a un joven no coja un adoquín cuando quizás se le murió su abuela por falta de esta gente? ¡Esto no se va a acabar!
Este era el huracán que teníamos estacionado en el centro del pecho.
Es ahora o nunca. Yo quiero vivir esta isla como se supone que la podamos vivir. Nuestra.
All right, so first of all, hola everybody. My name is Debbie Perez and I am the host of Borican Podcast. This week we have filmmaker Cecilia Aldarondo with us. Cecilia, gracias. I'm so glad you are taking the time to chat.
My pleasure. It's really nice to be here and talk with you.
Yeah, and I before we delve into the interview questions, I always like to start off by just asking the people I'm talking to, how are you doing in the midst of this pandemic? Where are you too? And anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I'm actually okay. I'm doing, I'm doing. I live in New York, so I'm based in Catskill, New York, and I'm looking out over a lot of fresh snow. We had a beautiful snowstorm, and I have the luxury of being able to work from home, and so yeah, I'm basically living the lockdown life and just doing everything I can to get my film out into the world in the virtual way, which is one of the blessings of being able to have a film, is that we can actually do that. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I guess let me start off by reading your bio, because just for anyone who might not know your name or what you worked on. So Cecilia is a documentary director, producer from the Puerto Rican diaspora who makes films at the intersection of poetics and politics. Her feature documentary, Memories of a Penitent Heart, had its world premiere at the 2016 Tribeca Film Festival. She is a 2019 Guggenheim Fellow, a 2017 Woman at Sundance Fellow, a two-time MacDowell Colony Fellow, and a recipient of the 2019, I'm gonna mess this up, Bogliasco Foundation residency. In 2019, she was named to DOC NYC's 40 Under 40 list and is one of Filmmaker Magazine's 25 New Faces of Independent Film. You currently teach at Williams College, and the reason I wanted to bring you on was to talk about Landfall, your documentary about Puerto Rico and sort of the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and many other things, which we'll talk about. But Cecilia, I'll give you also an opportunity. Why don't you tell listeners and viewers a bit about yourself and your work and anything else that you wish to share?
Yeah, I guess I am, what I would share is that I'm a filmmaker somewhat by accident. I set out to make, I didn't set out to make films initially in my life, and I I made my first film when I was in my mid-30s because I found out that my gay uncle died of AIDS and nobody wanted to talk about it. And so I decided to make a film about it. So I came to film as somebody who was really passionate about film and loved film, but always a bit afraid to call myself an artist. So I always identify with people who are, you know, finding their purpose and passion in life, maybe not in the traditional way.
That's interesting too, because I feel that, especially after Maria, everybody was trying to find a way. So I think that sometimes tragedy, trauma can sometimes bring that out, like this need to express yourself through art. So I appreciate you sharing that. I also really want to see that documentary, your uncle's documentary. I saw the trailer and I will be sharing links to all of this as for sure for everyone to watch, but really beautiful. So thank you. So let's see, why don't I do a quick little about the film, because I did see that you have a really wonderful description of what your film is about. So let me just share that with everyone. So through shard-like glimpses of everyday life in post-Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico, Landfall is a cautionary tale for our times, set against the backdrop of protests that toppled the US colony's governor in 2019. The film offers a prismatic portrait of collective trauma and resistance. While the devastation of Maria attracted a great deal of media coverage, the world has paid far less attention to the storm that preceded it, a $72 billion debt crisis crippling Puerto Rico well before the winds and waters hit. Landfall examines the kinship of these two storms, one environmental, the other economic, juxtaposing competing utopian visions of recovery. It features intimate encounters with Puerto Ricans as well as newcomers flooding the island, and it reflects a question of contemporary global relevance. When the world falls apart, who do we become? So I know you're doing tons of interviews and Q&As on this, and I just wanted to start this interview a little bit differently. I want to give you the floor more and ask you, where would you like to start in terms of the documentary, you know, wherever you want to start, at the beginning, the middle, at the end. Just curious sort of what you want to share with listeners about your documentary.
Well, I mean, maybe the first thing that comes to mind, I was thinking about this and as you're rereading the synopsis, this idea that when the world falls apart, who do we become? I'm planning a class this semester called Art in Times of Crisis, which is looking at the role of art in emergency situations. And I think we have a tendency to think about art as a luxury or as decorative or as something that only people with leisure time pursue. And we have a tendency to think about art as somehow outside of politics or separate from our political lives. And I think that one of the things that I sought out to achieve with Landfall was to go beyond the stereotypes of how Puerto Rico was being seen post Maria, and I think that part of that is that I was seeing not just making my film, but I'm actually looking at a book right now by Yarimar Bonilla called Aftershocks of Disaster, which has several chapters about art making after Maria and about how when the hurricane hit, there was this actual kind of explosion of people making artwork that was trying to grapple with and respond to and build community and and solidarity in this moment. So I think Puerto Rico is, for many, many reasons, really vital ground and a place for the world over to be paying attention to. And I just want to say one of those is the extraordinary creativity that is emerging at this moment.
I'm really glad you said that too, because I agree. I think it was either, I mean, I'm sure I've seen it multiple places, but people talking about how trauma, one way to heal and one way to address trauma is through art and is through creation. So I absolutely think that even the fact that you captured it, but the fact that you put this together says a lot. It says a lot about how we can move forward from trauma. So I want to ask you too, because in sort of in that light too, you brought together people not just from the diaspora, but also from Puerto Rico to kind of come together and collectively make this. So can you talk a little bit about what that was like and why that was important to you?
Yeah, the very beginning of the film is sort of quietly framed as a conversation between a diasporic Puerto Rican and a Puerto Rico-based Puerto Rican. We never really say this in the film. There's a lot that's kind of left, unsaid. But the film opens with two people sitting on a beach in the dark at night in San Juan. And it's actually me and my collaborator on the film, Lala Nemero Pastor, who is an activist and DJ and artist based in Puerto Rico. And one of the things that that we hear in voiceover right at the beginning of the film is, I forget exactly what the line was, but it's like, si no hubiera sido por María, tú y yo no estaríamos aquí en esta playa, or like if it weren't for María, you and I would not be sitting here on this beach. And part of it is that we did not know each other before Maria, and it was through the work that we were both doing post Maria that we ended up in each other's lives. And I say that because to me, one of the things, I think it's very important for me to always talk about not just my Puerto Ricanness, but the fact that I am from the diaspora, because that sort of gulf of understanding, that cultural memory, that sense of everyday lived reality. There are so many things that being in the diaspora robs you of. And I had to it was very, very confronting making this film to recognize that there was just so much that I wasn't aware of and understanding because I didn't grow up in Puerto Rico. I don't live in Puerto Rico day to day. And also because colonialism robs us of our memory and history. There were just so many things, so many gaps in my understanding. So anyway, all of this is to say that it was really, really important for me to work very closely at every step of the way with Lale. And the film in many ways it's very much a collaboration between the two of us. And Lale had a tremendous impact on the shaping of the film and what ended up on screen ultimately. So I always feel like it's really important to first and foremost talk about this as a byproduct of that conversation, which was very difficult sometimes and often a lot of disagreement and debates and tears shed and hugs and laughs and all things.
Yeah, that's interesting. First of all, I want to mention what you were first saying, that you don't quite explain it, but I like how unapologetic the documentary is about, like, you don't explain anything. It's just, this is what it is. And then I really appreciate that. And I think hopefully more people can watch it and see that. But I did watch an interview with Lale. I met her once, and I don't know if she'll remember me, but she has a very powerful voice on the island. So I'm really glad that you guys did connect. But I love what you said. I think a lot of people in the diaspora started to meet people on the island literally because of Maria. So I think that's really important to say, that it really impacted not just what happened in terms of like people lost family and things like that, but also just the fact that we started to create these bridges that weren't there before. And one thing that Lale said in one of the interviews you guys had really, it hit me pretty hard. She said that you guys had a conversation where she was asking, where was the diaspora? Why did you show up now? And I thought that hit me so hard, because that's literally what I thought when Hurricane Maria hit. I was like, where have I been? What what happened that we weren't involved sooner? And I guess if you could speak to that a little bit, I'd really appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can say that the one of the most difficult conversations that Lale and I had, which we had many, I will never forget. And I actually asked Lale at a certain point, I said, so, what do you wish the diaspora would do? And I thought that this was a respectful question, in that we had talked a lot, and I'd seen a lot of this kind of almost sort of neo-colonialist impulse, whether it's innocent or not, of people from the diaspora wanting to come home and maybe reclaim their roots, have a journey of return, but not necessarily be sensitive to their own blind spots. And sometimes that would actually produce people often with more resources than people who were living there, coming back and sort of telling people who to be and what to do, and acting like, you know, me lo sé todo. And it's like this kind of entitlement that can come with that return. And so I didn't want to do that. So I said, you know, you tell me, what do you think that the diaspora should do? And Lale said, organize yourselves. Lale was like, it's not my job to tell you what to do. You know, like I've got enough on my plate. Like Lale was just like, you know, screw you. Like, she wasn't, didn't use that language exactly, but it was a kind of very forceful, like, I'm so tired of having to guide you in your journey. Like, this is your stuff. And I just remember we had this very intense back and forth where I said, okay, well, that's well and good, but we were very aware and talking all the time about, like, on the one hand, yes, there are these beautiful ties between the diaspora and Puerto Rico, but there are also a lot of tensions and a lot of really deep divisions and points of disconnect. And so I was saying, you know, hey, I want to be an ally here. Like, how do we, you know, let's bridge the gulf, let's bridge the divide. And it was such an interesting paradoxical conversation, because it was by having that really difficult conversation, and we were both in tears by the end of it. It was such an important laying it all out of the dynamics, and it only sort of cemented our, you know, we basically became, I think, even more committed to having difficult conversations at every step of the way. It didn't sort of make suddenly everything was smooth. But anyway, that's part of what I mean about this film being a kind of, I hope, a proposition for people who want to go on that journey. It's not an easy one, and I think it's sort of an ongoing, never-ending, unresolved process of continuing to work on those connections and potential pitfalls.
Wow, that's beautiful. And very much something that I also encountered as well, because you're right. I think there's a lot of this feeling of like, oh, we're Puerto Rican, let's just connect. And that in itself it shows a lack of really understanding to the history and and just like what Lale said, it's not my job. It's not my job to do that. So I love the fact that you said uncomfortable conversations as well, because when it comes even to race, I had a conversation with Barbara, La Doctora Barbara Abadia-Rexach, and the last episode to just talk about race and how, like, it's not one conversation we have today and everything is fine. It takes multiple uncomfortable conversations and having to recognize when you might be wrong too. So I really appreciate that. So you worked with Lale. Lale was the producer on this documentary. Can you tell me how the team kind of came together, how long it took, and some of those details? Because I would love to know a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah. So just to kind of clarify, the project originated really through the chaos of Maria. I had, like many people in the diaspora, this experience of not being able to get a hold of my family. My grandmother at the time was wheelchair bound and needed 24-hour care. And she actually died a few months after Maria, I think February or March of the following year. And so there was a deep emotional knee-jerk feeling of like, oh my God, what do I do? How can I help? And I said, I can make a film. And I had a previous relationship with an organization called Field of Vision, which supports independent documentary production. And I had made a short that they had funded. And so I went to them and I said, I want to do this. And they supported me in a sort of initial trip. And I was also working with a producer, Ines Hoffman-Kana, who is a very experienced documentary producer who is originally from Germany, had never been to Puerto Rico, doesn't speak a word of Spanish, very, but is very, very, very experienced in documentary production and a wonderful person. And so anyway, we were, and then we started working. So Lale, I met Lale through this whole process. And I also had an incredible director of photography named Pablo Alvarez Mesa, who is actually from Colombia originally, and he was raised there, and he lives in Canada now. So we had a very actually quite a heterogeneous team, and I think that actually that was in a sense it was helpful. Like I'm never a kind of either or person. I'm more of a both and in the case of this production, while it was extremely important to have someone like Lale on the team who was living and breathing the crisis in Puerto Rico every day and was so much more knowledgeable in many ways than I was, it was also really, really important when we were shooting to have someone like Pablo who both really understood, I think, on a very deep level, a lot of the issues that are sort of similar in places like Colombia, and had a really deep ethical connection to the project, was extremely careful about how we film with people. And you're talking about traumatized people, like these are many of people we were filming with were really, really traumatized. And so anyway, he was very sensitive, and it was kind of helpful to have somebody who wasn't Puerto Rican actually on the core production team. So it was really the three of us who shot the film together, and we would sort of wander around Puerto Rico filming. And then the times when Lala and I were really struggling in our debates, it was really helpful to have, I wouldn't say Pablo was entirely neutral, but he had perspective that helped us to get out of our kind of loggerheads. And then I should also mention that the film was edited by a Canadian editor named Tara Jean Long, who also had never been to Puerto Rico until Ricky Rosselló, until the protests. And that at the very last minute, she ended up coming and recording sound. But anyway, I like working, I want the most inclusive and diverse team possible, but I also find that it's just as important to work with people who have the right ethics and creative sensibilities that you do. So yes, in the end, it was everybody brought their particular talents and experiences, and it was can I curse on this podcast? I don't know.
You could say whatever you want.
Okay, no, when I'm working with these collaborators, I've developed what I call a no assholes policy.
I love that.
So that's really my biggest thing, is that I love everybody that worked on this film really deeply, and we've come to really value one another as human beings.
That's wonderful. Oh my God. And then the other question was how long did it take to make the documentary?
Well, in independent documentary years, it's pretty quick, but it wasn't, I think, as quick as a lot of people. We started shooting right after Maria, basically in 2017, and we finished the film in 2020, basically in March. We were supposed to premiere the film in April at the Tribeca Film Festival, and the pandemic happened, and then everything, all hell broke loose. But yeah, so it took about 2.5 years, which is not very long for an independent documentary, because it's very, very, very hard to make independent documentaries, and they can take years and years. So there were times when I felt like it was taking way too long and it needed to come out yesterday because of everything happening in Puerto Rico. But yeah, it took about 2.5 years all told.
Yeah, and especially because of everything that was happening. I just thinking about 2017 to 2020, there's so many things coming out about Puerto Rico in even the mainstream media that, I sometimes say I'm shocked when mainstream media covers it, but also the way they cover it. So I want to talk a little bit about why you chose the way that you did the documentary because it has a very distinctive poetic nature. So I saw it for the first time at the Philly Latino Film Festival. But yeah, it has a very distinctive look to it. So if you could speak to that and why you chose that.
Yeah, one of the things is that I think that most films about disaster are really, I don't know how to put this, they're wrong. I found that when I started making this film that I wanted to refuse the visual language of disaster. And what I mean by that is that there was a pornography to the way Puerto Rico was being depicted. And, you know, we saw this after Hurricane Katrina. We see it with all kinds of, you know, we saw it in Syria. We see it whenever there's sensational imagery to be had, the media can be counted upon to look for those images and to traffic in those images as if that, you know, by circulating images of trauma, you know, police shooting videos, another example, as if by like participating in the circulation of these images, we're going to somehow change the world for the better. And I would argue that we actually do the opposite. I think that the image that was circulating of Puerto Rico and of Puerto Ricans specifically was highly victimizing. And for the most part, people were being seen as passive, as basically waiting with our arms outstretched for the US government to save Puerto Rico, when in fact, what was really not being talked about was a much more animated, extraordinary, agency-filled, community-driven, these acts of solidarity and response were really instructive for the world over. And you know, there was an article that just came out about the film a few weeks ago that the headline was "Not Victims but Leaders," and this was not the story that was being told in the mainstream press about Puerto Rico. So Landfall is trying to say, no, like Puerto Rico is full of leaders, and I think this is true also about anyone from marginalized positions. If you're talking about colonized people, people of diverse sexualities, disabled, very often if we come from one of those subject positions, we are looked at and pitied, not thought of as the people with the answers or the people who you should follow. And so I think that was something that I just I was really bothered by, and so that was part of it, that I wanted to make a film that would first and foremost centralize people in Puerto Rico as agents. And then also the film has quite a poetic and lyrical tone, in part because this is a film about grief and trauma. And it's as much, you know, it's hard because I think that especially outside of Puerto Rico, if you're talking about an audience that is I hate the word general audience, because I think general audience usually talks about a privileged audience. It's usually for lack of a better word, white middle class audience. So if you're reaching the typical audience that a big documentary is supposed to reach, very often you are obligated to give more context, more information to inform the uninformed, right? So I didn't want to make a film that would cater first and foremost to people who, if they've been to Puerto Rico, they've only come on vacation. And I wanted to really sort of insist upon a film that would first and foremost work for Puerto Ricans, first and foremost work for Puerto Ricans live in crisis, and would really serve as a kind of listening proposition. So it's not that everybody's invited to watch this film, and I want everybody to watch this film. But if you're not an expert on Puerto Rico, part of the proposition is that you sort of sit a spell and you bear witness and you hold space. It's a film that tries to hold space for the trauma of Maria, and for those that are actually traumatized by Maria, that they are held by the film, that the film holds that space for them, and that the people around that experience, the people, the other witnesses can also hold that space. So it's a lot of different reasons why the film is the way it is. But I felt like I couldn't live with myself if I made a film that tried to explain things to Puerto Ricans that Puerto Ricans don't need explaining. So I made a choice, and it's unusual, I think, for that reason. It's been an interesting thing to, some of the reviews we get say, oh, this film didn't have enough context for me, or this film didn't explain enough for me. And I'm like, maybe it's not for you. Maybe you're not the number one viewer. So anyway, that was a lot of different reasons, but it's, I have a lot of strong opinions about what I don't want to do as a director. And I think beautiful things can happen when you refuse.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I love that. And I love what you said about almost like, I feel like in some ways, perhaps people think of documentaries as like a conversation, but it's also, it could be like, no, it could be more like you listen. And I think the listening part wasn't happening, especially after Maria. Like nobody was listening. Nobody was seeing, like you said, the leaders, the community leaders that were literally at the front lines. There wasn't any help coming. There wasn't any food or water coming. And it was really the many community leaders on the ground there, and, the mixing of the diaspora too. But I want to ask you a little bit about the sort of, as you were capturing the voices of the leaders there, is there anything in particular that you learned from them, or maybe you could talk about sort of parts of the film that really stuck out, or that people have maybe mentioned to you. But I'm very curious about what, because I watched it, but maybe anyone who hasn't watched it yet, what you've learned from, or what you can learn from the leaders that you were able to capture.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is even what we think of as leaders is something that is being challenged actively in Puerto Rico. Just say if we start with the resignation of Ricardo Rosselló, there is a way in which, if we want to talk about this current, one of the insights of this political moment that Puerto Rico offers is a great and important skepticism of our so-called leaders, right? Those who are often given the most power to speak, to make decisions, that are credentialed, and in a typical documentary, very often that power is only reaffirmed, right? If you want the testimony of a quote unquote expert, you go and find a lawyer or a judge or a college professor or a politician. And one of the precepts or the rules of Landfall was insisting that that everyone in Puerto Rico is a leader. Everyone in Puerto Rico is an expert, particularly those who are doing the work day to day of community building. And that is not necessarily the province, especially of your elected politicians. And so that was one of the rules. We said no politicians for sure, but we even if we had people who did have a deep level of expertise, that's part of the reason why we don't identify people as credentialed experts. We don't say, oh, you're going to believe this person more because they have a doctor next to their name, or we see them with a bunch of books behind them. So instead, what we wanted to do was sort of, the part of the way we filmed the film was by being in place with people and sort of saying it is in everyday life that people are experts in Puerto Rico. It is in lived experience. And so, I'll just, one example is we spend, well, I can use two examples. One is we visit a place called Bartolo, which is near Lares, which is one of many incredible projects of reclamation in Puerto Rico. In this case, right after Maria, a group of people reclaimed an abandoned school, and we spend time in the school kind of witnessing people. It's an experiment in kind of lived democracy of you know, people living in the school, but also growing food and having community meetings and coming together. And, you know, we're not saying, again, the expertise comes from those who are engaged in the project. Similarly, we spent a lot of time in Vieques, and our guides, if you will, or the people we spend time with in Vieques are this young couple, Ura and Neisha. Ura is one of the third generation of a long line of very, very involved activists in Vieques, people who have been fighting for Vieques liberation for 3 generations. And but we don't necessarily say that about him, right? His knowledge of Vieques comes from his sense of place and what he shares with us. So again, we tried to have a kind of anti-institutional vibe, because again, I think there's this moment in Puerto Rico is, you know, this is first and foremost a collective portrait. Like, we could have had almost anyone in this film. And that's part of it. It's like, yes, there are people who are really, really doing the work, who we want to acknowledge their expertise, and we want to thank them and respect them. But we also want to acknowledge that this is a tremendous moment of collective action. So, you know, that's a big part of not just why we don't rely on these kinds of experts, but also why the film is shot the way it's shot, why we spend a lot of time just kind of hanging out with people. It seemed like it was more true to contemporary Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because that brings me into the question of the summer protests, right? Because I think one of the things that was really clear is that there wasn't a leader to these protests. It was a collective experience of so many people coming out. There wasn't like a person that you look to and who said, like, this is what we're going to do. So I love that the documentary, yeah, you capture that for sure. Can you tell me a little bit about the summer protests? Like you said, we don't need to explain why it happened, but can you tell me a little bit about what your documentary captured, and like maybe anything that you felt you learned or that you hope that people take away from watching the documentary, and specifically that?
Well, when the protests erupted in the summer of 2019, we thought we were almost done. We thought we had finished shooting. We actually had what we thought was a pretty advanced edit of the film. And I remember we were doing a rough cut screening in New York, Tara, the editor, and I, as the protests were starting to unfold. And I remember we walked through Union Square in Manhattan, and we walked through a massive diasporic protest on our way to the rough cut screening. And we were like, this is happening. And I was constantly checking in with Lale and saying, you know, what is going on? Because we didn't know the extent of, and it was happening so quickly. It was literally like a matter of days, right? Where these, this domino effect of these protests. And I would ask Lale, like, who's organizing? She would be like, okay, this is happening, and then this, you know, there's this protest in Viejo San Juan, and then there's this other action on the, you know, on the highway. And I would say, well, who's organizing? And she would say, I don't know. It's just every day there's something new. Every day I'm finding out, like, and you know, I think in your typical kind of activist circles, usually if you're really ensconced in the activism, you know, like, who's organizing what. And this was one of these things where it was like, you know, it's big when you don't actually have a clue where it's all originating from, and where it was very organic. It got to a scale that was quite organic and happening really quickly. And so, I mean, it was a matter of I think there was like a 24-hour period where we were like, I think we really need to document this. We really need to film this. We really should be there. And so and it was a crazy sort of last minute decision. And that's why Tara ended up coming and becoming a sound recordist instead of an editor. And our good friend Martin, who Pablo couldn't come, he was on another shoot. And so my friend Martin just said, I'll come with you. And he shot, so all the protest footage ended up being shot by him. And the final footage in the film was also shot by him. And so, yeah, we just had this crazy, you know, we just got on a plane, and I'm so glad for so many reasons. I mean, there were times when, you know, I felt bad that we were filming when it's the thing about filming, making documentaries is that, you know, the camera can be a real barrier to being present. And so there were times when, you know, when there's a scene, for example, where people are seeing in Viejo San Juan, and, you know, it's funny, you can hear me, like I'm singing at the top of my lungs. But I just wanted to be there, you know, and instead we're like having to, you know, think about the film and does this fit in the film and what, you know, anyway, but it was really amazing. And I think in part what was so important for us was when, before the protests, we were really, I don't know how else to say it, we were really sad at how little pushback had happened, and we were looking for signs of resistance, signs of response. We were so kind of dismayed at how to end the film, and the ending that we had was pretty like, well, hasta aquí llegamos, you know, it's like, this is what we've got. And it was not the most empowered way to end. And I think that the protests gave us evidence that, you know, it was a very cathartic moment, and it almost like it took that long. I think it was such an explosion of what felt like deferred feelings, deferred grief, deferred rage, deferred anger, resentment, all the stuff that had just built up and just exploded. And so it felt really important to offer a kind of antidote to the tragedy, frankly, and to say, you know, this is because this was an example for the world over, this moment, I think, of resistance. So yeah, it was really meaningful to be there, and I think the film would not be the film without it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's so wild that that wasn't initially a part of it, but then it happened. And especially in light of having captured all these really intense things that are happening, like you said, the economic issues, as well as the climate change, and as well as the disaster and how people are being portrayed. So it's great that you were able to capture the protest, because it says a lot. Not just, it wasn't just about the rage of what was found or why they started, but also like the pain that people had been carrying for a long time. And there are a number of scenes that you did of like kind of like a dinner, like La Cena, and like, can you talk a little bit about why that was important to sort of see people together in that kind of setting?
Yeah, so again, you know, throughout the film, I really wanted to capture elements of everyday life post Maria. One of the things I was really inspired by and thinking about was people would be talking about moments of pleasure and rest and community building amidst the disaster. I just think about people talking about some of the strange experiments people had when the power was out. And somebody told me a story about throwing a rave at an abandoned hotel like a month after Maria, when the power was still gone, and you know, getting a bunch of bootleg alcohol and finding a generator and throwing a party. And I was really keen to show that life amidst the cataclysm is full of beauty and is full of moments of that are not, it's not just this constant tragedy. And also, especially when you're at a moment of reckoning, to say, I don't know where to go from here. To me, community is so key in those grappling moments, in the confusion, in the question of where do we go from here. That is not a solitary question, or it can be. It's just worse that way. And so I wanted really to give the film a sense of community and a sense of these moments of pleasure. So I also felt it was hard because we had to think about ways to inform the viewer. Like, I know I just said all this stuff about like making things kind of oblique, but I did want to make a film that would inform people about basic things in Puerto Rico. For example, La Junta, which is very, confusing to people who don't know very much about the debt and promesa and the legislation and the people that are in charge and what they're doing. There's just a lot of information. So we were also just thinking practically of like, how can we get some of this info in a way that feels relaxed and kind of genuine? So anyway, all of this is why we got this idea, said, what if we kind of had a dinner party and put people together and then just had them talk about stuff. So it was in a way kind of staged in that we curated it. We were thinking about, this was really a major contribution of Lales. A lot of these are Lales friends, but really coming from, they didn't all know each other necessarily super well. They all kind of from different walks of the relief work and justice work happening in Puerto Rico. They all wanted they were willing to talk about these issues. So we basically cooked, had a big meal and had them all over, and then we filmed, and I basically sat in the corner. I'm not in the footage, but I just sort of said, okay, can you talk about this? And I would plant questions, kind of like you're asking me questions now. I would just say, okay, so can you guys just sort of talk about the junta and what they're doing? Talk about the debt and what the impact is. Talk about what it's like. I would say, well, what about hope? And there's somebody saying, okay, hope. What is this? Anyway, so we just covered all the bases, and we didn't know if it would work, but I didn't want it to feel like you just have somebody explaining things to you. I wanted it to feel like you are in the community yourself as a viewer. And that's part of why it's shot handheld and it's very close, and you're sort of being dropped into conversation. And it was, again, it wasn't just coming out of nowhere. I was seeing all the time. One of the things I was talking to somebody about in another conversation about the film was about how I think that a lot of, in my family, I'm like the activist of the family in a way. And I find that very often in certain communities, there's an idea you shouldn't talk politics at the table. And I'm always talking politics with my friends at the table. Like, that's what we do. And so I wanted also to have this feeling of like political transformation happens in dinner parties when you're hanging out with your friends, when you're just talking, you're trying to reckon with something and grapple, like that spirit of debate and passion and just trying to figure things out without necessarily having all the answers. So anyway, there's a lot of different reasons why it felt like something worth trying. And there's a lot of trial and error in documentary and a lot of things that don't work. And in this case, I think it was really valuable to me that we were able to do it.
That's awesome. That's beautiful. I have a question too. Has everyone who was in it been able to see the film yet, or
almost
is that something you're planning? Okay.
Before,
what was their reaction?
Well, so before we finished the film, I went back to Puerto Rico, and Lale and I arranged a screening for as many people that were in the film as possible. Because we really didn't want to, unless if there was some major issue or people were really upset by it. I also think because it's such an intensely emotional film, we wanted people to have a chance to see it and talk about it in person with me. There's an enormous trust that people who agree to participate in a documentary give to the people making the film. And we really wanted to respect that commitment and sacrifice and effort. And so we wanted to, we wanted to make sure that people saw it first. But of course, there are a lot of people in this film and not everybody had a chance to see it. So for example, Ura and Neisha, the young people from Vieques, they couldn't come because they're in Vieques. And they just finally saw the film. I kept, part of it is an internet thing. Like I kept sending them links and they couldn't get the right, anyway. And so I finally saw the film, and somebody else is watching the film this week. So we're really trying to make sure that everybody can see it. But yeah, poquito a poco, we're getting it out there.
And speaking of getting it out there, when is there a place that people can go see it now? Is it upcoming in festivals? Can you tell us where can people see it? Yeah.
So because it's an independent documentary, independent documentaries have their, it's not like you just, wake up tomorrow and it's on Netflix, right? So we are, we've been in a lot of film festivals. So you saw it at a film festival. People have been able to see it that way. Right now, the best thing people can do is follow the film on social media. Because we keep people updated that way. I mean, you can also sign up to be on our newsletter by signing up on the film's website, which is landfallfilm.com. But if you find us on Facebook, Landfall Documentary, and Twitter, I think it's landfall_doc, and then Landfall Film on Instagram, we are always telling people how to see the film whenever they can. One of the things that we're starting to organize now is a series of virtual events for the spring, specifically targeting the diaspora, around certain key themes of the film. We're just devising this and developing partnerships with diasporic initiatives and organizations. So you can definitely look out. We're going to be making the film available this spring as part of that. We're also planning an in-person tour in Puerto Rico, hopefully this summer, which is going to be obviously COVID safe and COVID, but we're going to try and do an outdoor tour to take the films directly to communities that either participated in the film or doing important work. And then the biggest thing, I guess, in terms of scale is that the film is going to be broadcast on PBS. And that's going to be, I think, probably this summer as well. And that means the film will be available nationwide across the US for free to anybody who wants to see it. Unfortunately, the PBS station in Puerto Rico has been privatized. And so we're trying to find other ways to get the film on TV in Puerto Rico. So stay tuned for that. But this is why public good and public resources are so important. This is why I love PBS. Important. So support your local PBS station, people. It's actually important. So lots of different ways. The film will definitely be, and then eventually it'll be on Vimeo and things like that. But yes, if people have a little patience and wait a few weeks and a few months, they'll be able to finally see it. But they absolutely should follow us on social media. And right now we're in the middle of a kind of very DIY Oscars campaign. So the more people tell other people about the film, the better. It's really the word of mouth, the spreading about the film is very key.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I will do a lot of that as well. And can I guess ask you, and I have so many other questions I could ask you, but I wanted to ask you, is there, I guess, anything else about the film that you wanted to share with anyone? And then if people want to talk to you or contact you about the film, can you share that as well?
Yeah, again, I think the best way to reach us is through our social media channels. Definitely sending, we respond to every message we get on, Facebook or Instagram or whatever. So I think that's, and we love hearing from people when they've seen the film and sharing their thoughts. I totally welcome people to contact us that way. And then as far as the film goes, I think Puerto Rico is one of these places, colonized places are chronically overlooked and invisibilized. And I think that just for me, I want to get past, on the one hand, this is a film that I really, really want it to be for whatever a Puerto Rican viewer might need, to offer, again, to go back to this idea of holding space. But I think for those that might not necessarily think that Landfall is a film for them, I really want to just reiterate that it's a goal of the film to invert that narrative and to sort of, to really insist that communities and people who are most directly impacted by crisis are the people to learn from. They're not necessarily the people to feel sorry for, or maybe, rescue. People in Puerto Rico don't need rescuing. What they do need is attention and listening and learning, and maybe a donation here and there. But definitely, I think we are in this moment of unprecedented global crisis, and it's really important, I think, that those who are crisis experts be allowed to be given the platform to do their job as experts and teach everyone else. So yeah, I think everyone should be studying Puerto Rico. It's not only an amazing place, it's a really fertile place to learn from.
Wow. Powerful. Thank you so much, Cecilia. And yeah, very excited to share this interview with everyone. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure, be in touch again soon. Thank you. Thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I love talking about this film, especially with my Boricua audience. So